Hi guys, I'm Daksh from Greptile, and before we get into the podcast with Julianna from Stytch, I want to tell you all that we at Greptile are hiring. For those of you that don't know, Greptile is building AI tools for developers. We build APIs that understand your code base, and you can plug them into your tools to make custom internal AI developer tools. We have raised over $5 million to date. We serve hundreds of customers. We're growing very, very fast. We're backed by Y Combinator, SC Angel, Initialized Capital, and more. And if you are looking to join a very fast-paced team that ships, is growing fast, this might be the place for you. You should reach out. We have our job listings on workatastartup.com, and you can learn more about us at greptile.com. All right, let's get into the episode. Thank you.
This is Who's a Good Dev, the podcast where we interview great software developers, brought to you by Greptile.com.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Who's a Good Dev. I'm so excited for today's episode. We have Julianna Lamb here, who is the CTO of Stytch. I could talk a lot about Stytch, but I want to let Julianna introduce herself. Also, Rajat is here again from last episode. Rajat works at Greptile.
Yes, I'm here now.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat. So I'm Julianna. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Stytch. Met my co-founder Reed working together at Plaid. I was on their engineering team, and Reed was on their product team. And we basically ran into a bunch of problems with fraud and authentication. So I built out a fraud engine there that was protecting against things like credential stuffing, account takeover attacks. We ended up wanting to build out a bunch of Auth features to help protect accounts. And when we went to go and do that, we looked at all the vendors. We were looking for a really sort of like developer-friendly, powerful API-first authentication platform. Came up short, didn't find it, spent a bunch of time building that all out in-house. I then went to another company, VGS, and one of the projects I worked on there was ripping out Auth0 and replacing it with an in-house Auth solution. And so I was catching up with Reed after I'd left Plaid, basically complaining about having to build authentication in-house a second time, and how surprising it was that there wasn't sort of more powerful tooling on the market. So that was kind of the origin of Stytch, which I think tells a lot about like who Stytch is and what we're working on, which is building really powerful tools, APIs, SDKs for developers to build authentication and fraud detection and prevention into their applications.
What was the reason to roll it off the second time around? Like, what was the inception there?
Yeah, there were a few sort of limitations we were running into with Auth0's universal login approach. If you just need login to a web application and nothing super sort of like customized, it gets the job done. We were trying to do a few different experiences. One was we had a CLI tool that we wanted to do authentication with and share identities across. We wanted to do sort of a copy of GitHub's like sudo mode. If you go and change a sensitive setting in GitHub, you have to do an authentication event. Usually it's like a two-factor authentication. We wanted to replicate that. And so now we're starting to pull login into different sort of aspects of the product. And building that out was going to be next to impossible with Auth0, just because their definition of authentication is like you do that initial login, you get a session, and that's the end of the story. So we're like, okay, we could like figure out how to build some workarounds here, but that doesn't really seem like a good time investment because we could probably just build this ourselves in the same amount of time. And so ended up going the in-house route.
Okay. We talked about this earlier. We've used a lot of words so far. Auth, I think we'll probably get to identity pretty soon. So just let's kind of
define the terms to start with.
What is Auth?
Yeah. So Auth can be either Auth-N or Auth-Z as well. People tend to use it in like an overloaded term. Mm-hmm. Authentication is, verifying information about a user. Do they have something they know? Do they like have possession of some security device? So what that means in practice is like, do they know a password to log in? Do they have possession of an OAuth SSO account, like a Google account? Do they have, a YubiKey or a hardware token? It's verifying kind of like that they should have access to that account. And then Auth-Z is more around authorization, permissions. Once you get logged into the account, what do you have access to? What do you have permissions to do? And so I think typically auth, when you say it, means authentication. Sometimes it's overloaded to mean authorization as well. But it's, kind of like a nebulous term to some degree there.
Got it. Is it like the difference between being able to like log into a company Google Drive account versus being able to access specific folders, like the simplest version of authentication versus authorization?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, got it. Interesting. So are those the two things, Auth Z and Auth N? And I think we touched upon a little bit, like with what is when people say identity, are they just saying like can we say that this is the human being that is supposed to be able to access this thing? Is that what identity is?
That is definitely one definition of it. I think there's a term that like we use that's very like the enterprise term for describing what we do, which is customer identity and access management. So sometimes identity can be more around kind of like identity verification. Do you have like the government issue ID that matches like this selfie that you're taking or whatever other sort of like verification methods they're doing? And that's like, are you like a very specific human is basically what that type of verification is doing. When we're talking about like customer identity and access management, we're sort of talking about like who is your identity in the context of this sort of like interaction, this application. So in the Google account example, like who are you in the context of this Google account? Who are you relative to like the other people that have access to that account? What permissions do you have? What's your role? What sort of information is uniquely identifying that you should have access to that account, like an email address, a password, those other things. So it's kind of like all of that encompassing sort of like who you are, what you have access to, who your identity is in the context of that application.
Gotcha. Everywhere I think I've worked, we eventually, once we got big enough, we had challenges with authentication and just auth providers. So what is it about auth and building auth and designing auth for developers that's so challenging?
Yeah, it's a really like vast space. Like there's so many different permutations of how you can build authentication and build it correctly. There's so many different like methods you might want to use, maybe passwords, passwordless, two-factor, doing SSO with a bunch of different IDPs. It's just like a really sort of like, to some degree, endless space and all the different permutations of just like the authentication factors, let alone like the different ways that you want to build this into your stack, your application, like the example from VGS of like the CLI versus the web application. It's a really vast space. And so I think this is a reason I think you've historically seen like decent sort of vendor penetration, but a lot of people do build auth in-house because specifically sort of like tailoring to your use case, your application, the user experience you want to build. There's just like a lot of customization that people might want to do. So that was kind of like one of our theories starting Stytch, is that to be really intentional about the building blocks you're creating for people so that we're abstracting away like the confusing parts, the mistakes that you might make if you're not an auth expert, right? Like that's what you want from a vendor. You want them to solve problems for you, but also being flexible enough that you can build the experience that makes sense for your specific use case and not get too sort of like pigeonholed into a one-size-fits-all approach.
Interesting. We talked a little bit about like fraud prevention too as a like subcategory underneath. When you say fraud prevention, is that like just like unauthorized access to accounts, or is it a more of an umbrella term that's encompassing other things?
Yeah, so when we're talking about fraud prevention, it's typically focused on kind of like account abuse and fraudulent account creation or account takeover. So it's very sort of like account oriented. I'll give an example of what we're not talking about. It's like payment fraud. We don't touch that space. It's more around like the access and who is this person? Should they have access? Are they pretending to be someone they're not to try and gain access to something? Are they potentially going to like commit fraud and abuse of your systems? Sort of does this traffic look like normal, like it's a regular user logging in, coming back, whatever it might be?
Oh, so you'll be actually following the patterns of how someone's using the app to like, I guess, do you do like machine learning things with this and like figure out if people are matching patterns of fraud?
Yeah, so we do some of that today. We also expose signals that our customers can use directly, which kind of depending on their use case, that's a pretty typical workflow too, because you're going to know your application best. We'll take some of those signals and use that to do some sort of machine learning to identify, is this like anomalous behavior? Is are there like trends that are sticking out in this? But oftentimes our customers will also plug that into their own models too, or they'll know, specific behavior in their application is highly correlated with some fraudulent activity, and so they can kind of like piece it together in that way too.
Okay, yeah.
That's fascinating. I think, I didn't actually even know that about Stytch, but that's like a fantastic developer. For example, like the crypto gaming app that we were talking about earlier, like a false positive could be really devastating for them. And, I'm also interested, like the attack vectors in this space, I mean, it's really high dimensional. And obviously the cost of kind of getting it wrong can be so high in certain cases. So how do you think about what building blocks to create I'm also kind of just curious, like, has there ever been an issue where was there an abstraction that you guys made that you determined later on that like, okay, this was not the right thing for our customers here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's something that we're like always trying to kind of strike the right balance of being opinionated about like what we're building, but also like meeting our customers where they are. So one really big learning we had early on is that we started out as a fully passwordless company because we thought that was kind of like where the industry was moving, creates a better user experience in a lot of cases, can be beneficial from a security perspective. But I think what we found is that like we're just not there yet. Like there's a ton of use cases. Our customers need to build for their customers too. And so if you serve a like varied enough market, people are going to want passwords. And so we built passwords. I think when we built passwords too, we were pretty opinionated about like what made a good password. We thought that a lot of kind of like the old school trends like LUDs, lower uppercase digit symbol, were pretty like ineffective ways of enforcing like password uniqueness and password security. And so we wanted to build some sort of more clever, I think, ways of helping users create secure passwords. So there's like an algorithm that came out of Dropbox, ZXCVBN, that basically is more kind of looking at like overall complexity of a password. And so we like leaned into that, and then we got feedback from customers like, oh, I have this specific compliance requirement that actually requires me to do a very specific sort of like password strength enforcement that didn't match that. And we were like, okay, well, we maybe like disagree with that being like the best experience, but we're not gonna like make you have to argue with your auditors, right, about like what you're doing. And as long as we feel like it's, not compromising on security at the end of the day, like I think what we were trying to do is like help nudge users and help them like create better passwords. But I think sort of finding that line of like, okay, this is not going to be like a security issue. We won't do that. If like a customer is asking for something that's like, crazy sort of like workaround that maybe they've built into their app that isn't sort of a best practice, and they're trying to like match that with us. We hear that a lot. We're like, no, you're coming to us because like you want to get better. You want your security posture to increase, and like this is why we've intentionally designed these things in a certain way.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that it was this involved.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah. Does a best auth experience exist?
Within the context of like probably a certain like vertical or like customer base that you're serving, I think there's definitely like better experiences. But I think it can be such a like individualized sort of like perspective where like you and I might just disagree on like what we think is the easiest way to log into an application. And I think in a lot of cases, you need to like hit a certain threshold for security, basically. Like it needs to be secure. Once you get beyond that, like some things are just going to be personal preferences.
Do you like magic links?
I do like magic links, and a lot of people don't, and I understand that. A lot of people like autofill passwords over magic links because they just like have their password manager set up, right? I use a password manager. I have it set up, but it still annoys me. It's just really chaotic, and so I'd rather do the magic link.
Yeah, only the second factor. I like magic links a lot because I think the people that like or dislike magic links comes down to how quickly you open your email.
Yeah.
And I think if you need to go to a browser and type in mail.google.com because you don't check email very often, versus like if you work in a company where email is a very important way in which you communicate, and you go command space superhuman enter tab enter, if that's all you need, then like I can see how that would be. And then if you use arc, then command O is the only, and then so you're like literally within.
You're crazy with the keyboard shortcut.
Yeah. With 8 keystrokes, you're logged in, and like that's less than a password.
One fun thing we do with our Magic Link experience in our SDK is we'll kind of detect which email client we think you're using, and we'll like guide you to that.
What you
think so you can just like click on
Open your email.
on open in Google, and it'll filter for like the domain that the magic link came from, so that it shows up right there. Because
that's fantastic.
Yeah, some people
that's
don't
actually
have
detail.
their email spotlighted like I do.
Yeah, that's crazy. What do you think passwordless login didn't catch on as quickly as you would have suspected? Like, what is causing people to hold on to passwords? Other than like password manager is probably part of it, but other than that,
Yeah, I think it's a combination of convenience. Like a password is, in a lot of ways, very easy. People are really accustomed to it. And a passwordless experience, you typically need like something else. So sometimes there's a context where like maybe in a certain like workplace environment, you aren't logged into your email on a device you need to log into. Think of like a service industry where maybe you have to like log in to a shared device or something like that. So sometimes like there's use cases that you just don't have like your signed in, email experience. Maybe you don't have like a touch ID, face ID, or something biometric or YubiKey, whatever it might be. So there's like this sort of technology requirement that goes along with passwordless that I think can make it just like not a great fit in some use cases. At least today, I think like as technology continues to progress, like having Touch ID on a Mac, for example, is like a huge unlock. Being able to do passkeys is amazing, but not everyone has a Touch ID enabled laptop or phone or whatever it might be. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then I think some of it is just sort of like habit. Like people aren't used to passwordless across the board, right? I think it's starting to get introduced in like more widespread contexts. Like I think Instagram sort of pushes a magic link experience. So there's like sort of more introduction to consumers about passwordless, but I think we've spent the past like 15, 20 years like educating people about like password security. And so I think there's in some demographics like a hesitancy to like go passwordless because they don't understand the security implications and have spent so much time like being taught how to like do good secure passwords, which I think is a very like 10, 15-year-old ideology at this point of like, the 10 different multi-conditions of like what you have to meet. Like that's what people know is like account security. And so I think there's like this slow re-education that kind of needs to happen of like, what does it mean to have secure authentication?
I remember I think my like high school computer lab had this chart of how long it would take to brute force guess a password depending on what the password was. And it was like, it's 10. It was like the length is 12 and it's like a random string of alphanumeric and versus alphanumeric plus symbols, etc. And it would like get exponentially longer. And it was like the difference between a 30-second unlock password and like a billion years or something. That's crazy. We started programming we started programming around a time when I think like I don't know if this is true for you, Rajat, but the like standard advice was to not try to build your own auth and try to just outsource it wherever you can. I think like managed auth was definitely the standard. Would you say that's true? Like college? You're like projects and
I
stuff.
have no idea of how to manage a password.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that. So because I've never done it, I actually don't know what makes it hard because I've never tried. But I'm curious, like what is actually hard about like what's this is gonna sound like a dumb question to anyone who actually understands how auth works, but what's actually wrong with like storing usernames and passwords in a table and then doing a lookup? Like what's actually wrong with that? And then what do you do in a managed auth system that's like clearly vastly more sophisticated than that?
Yeah, so I think for very like basic auth use cases, like you want to do username and password, like I don't think that's like rocket science to build. I don't know that any of auth is necessarily rocket science, but I think there can be just like so many things that you have to think about and get right. There's just like so many pieces to it. For like the username password example, I think making sure that you're using sort of like the right like salt hashing technique so that those passwords are not going to be just like easily dumped from a database if some other breach or vulnerability happens in your application. Like I think that's when you see a lot of a company gets breached and they just had a bunch of passwords sitting there. I think the really risky thing about that is not even like your own application on protecting that. Like you could force a password reset for all of those users immediately and like pretty much send that attack if you know it happened at least, which is a whole other thing. But oftentimes people reuse the same password across many of their different online accounts. And so this was one of the things that I was working on at Plaid. Plaid as one API to connect to 10,000 different banks made it really easy to take those stolen credentials and see if they might get access to a user's bank account at any of those 10,000 different banks. And I think it's a really common practice to like reuse passwords. And so now you're not just like having to think about the security of like your own application, but if it got breached and those passwords got dumped, potentially you're leaving those users' other accounts open to account takeovers where they've reused that same password. So there's lots of things like that that are just like these sort of like next level implications or things you need to think through. I think account takeover vulnerabilities are really prevalent and can just be kind of like complicated to reason through. And so do you want to spend time reasoning through that, or do you want to build the product that you're building? You probably want to build the product you're building because that's what you're here to do. You're not here to like think about account takeover vulnerabilities. That's what I'm here to do. So there's a lot of things that like we build out to protect against that, but also to provide a good user experience. So one example of this, if you are using like an OAuth login, like Google, that's tied to your email, and then maybe you have password login as well, I might go to your site and sign up with Google initially. I might come back, forgot that I signed up with Google, try and enter a password, and that might end up creating a duplicate account. And now I'm like, where am I? I thought I had an account. We will securely deduplicate those where we can. So we'll do an email verification if we need to link those accounts, or if it's a verified email coming from something like Google, we'll just link those accounts. But you can't just like deduplicate across the board because a lot of OAuth providers don't verify emails, or you can change
Discord.
your email. Yeah, exactly. And so thinking through all of those little things and building out protections, I think is where Auth gets like really messy and complicated.
This might be then how I can figure out who's using Stytch, because I think recently I logged into something and I was like, and I remember as I was entering a password and logging in that the last time I'd done it was with Google, and I was like, it's gonna be a new account or sign out or something. And then it loaded for a little bit longer because it was like, I'm guessing trying to figure out what I was doing, and then it eventually figured out that was the account that I was using. I was like, oh, that's great. That's what deduplication is. It was Octolane, my CRM. I'm guessing they're using Stytch. That's how I know.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
probably. I don't know. I actually didn't know that Stytch was as new as it is. I kind of assumed in my head it was like, oh yeah, it's like Okta and Stytch are like around the same time. And when I looked this up maybe like a few weeks ago, I was like, oh, Okta is like a lot older than Stytch, and Stytch is shockingly new considering how incumbent it is. That's crazy. I want to get into more of this. So you said that that like OAuth is a method of login. Is it necessarily more secure than like storing passwords, or is it just because you're letting an expert store passwords and that's better? Like Google is just more secure at storing passwords than I am.
Yeah. So some of this also comes down to how you're securing your own Google account. They have a lot more functionality built out there. So like I have I think hardware key required for 2FA, stuff like that, right? And so you don't have to then build out your own 2FA. You can just rely on Google. I think they enforce it across the board now too. So you're getting a two-factored account when you're doing a sign-in with Google. So yeah, they're spending a lot more time and effort on like their own authentication and identity. And you're just trusting that versus like having to reinvent the wheel and build that all out yourself. You also aren't taking on then the liability of storing passwords. Like you're storing the information about like the OAuth connection, which is going to be scoped to your application. And so just going to be a little bit easier for you to manage, and you get sort of like the more, you get like cutting edge authentication where Google is going to be continuing to like offer new ways to log in as those are available.
Interesting. It sounds like Auth in terms of in describing companies like Stytch is almost a misnomer, because it's like, well, it's doing so much more than Auth, because it's almost Google doing the Auth part of it. You're doing all, because if you do Auth, you also have to do user management. It sounds like you also have to do like access control and that all the infrastructure around it, like things you have to do because you do Auth. You have to do all this other stuff.
Yeah, and I think otherwise, like, you're not getting a ton from an auth provider if they're kind of just like focused on login potentially, right? Like that's just one piece of it. If you have like the best login in the world, incredibly secure, and then you have like some open door on the back end where you're not doing the right authorization checks, doesn't matter, because someone's going to be able to like just get in around that. And so it's thinking about kind of like how are you not just securing that like point in time of authentication, but also making sure that once a user is into an account that they only have access to what they should. You're protecting all your endpoints, all of that.
Interesting. I saw on the website that you do Auth for a lot of consumer companies and a lot of B2B companies. I'm curious what the differences are with doing Auth for either. Like, are the standards different? What functionality differs? Like, what do they care about one versus the other?
Yeah, so I think we have a little bit of a unique take here that we believe they're like pretty different use cases. And so we've actually built two different product lines because we think that sort of how you build like best-in-class B2B authentication is going to be very different from consumer authentication. And a lot of this stems from the fact that in consumer, the user owns their account. In B2B, it's the organization or the customer that owns the account, and then their employees are going to be like members of that organization, but they don't own their account information. Company needs to be able to like deprovision someone when they leave, needs to be able to determine like who has access to what level of permissions. And so the way that you think about identity is very different for those two use cases. So we have two different data models that those product suites are built on top of. In B2C, it's a user-first data model. In B2B, it's an organization-first data model. And what that enables in B2B is things like per organization authentication controls. So you have two different customers. One is, say, Stytch. We're a startup. We use sign-in with Google for most things. We don't have like a super complex kind of like IDP setup. We just want sign-in with Google, but we want to enforce that. We want to require all of our users to sign in with that. You can do that. Then let's say you're selling to, I don't know, Intel, some very sort of like enterprise organization. Maybe they even have their own IDP that they've built in-house that they require everyone use to log in to all of the different SaaS applications. Maybe they're using something like sign in with Okta, whatever it might be. They want to enforce that. We can enable that as well. Maybe we don't care about session length because we think that we have pretty good control over sort of like our employees' devices and everything and have good security practices. So once you log in, we're fine with like that being, you know, a 30-day session. Intel's super paranoid and is like, no, people have to log in every 24 hours. You can enforce that too. You don't have to build any of that out. You get that out of the box with Stytch because of this organization-first data model. And then in consumer, like if the consumer wants to choose their preferences, they get that out of the box. If I want to have 2FA on my account, I can set that up. So it's kind of like who gets to decide how they can log in varies quite a bit. And so we've built these very sort of like intentionally different product suites for the two use cases.
That's so interesting. Our take on this has been interesting because we were a developer tools company, and I think those start as consumer companies, and they over time, because like we, for the first, I think few months, we didn't have any like sort of businesses using our product. It was a lot of hobbyists and developers. It was fine that we were just using Nextauth, and it's like consumer-esque. Our data model was user-based, not organization-based. And then when increasingly more companies started using the product, at first we were sort of hacking it together. Like, yeah, you're accounts have the same domain as your email or the same org, and the data model is flipped, where like an attribute of your account is that you're part of an organization, and then we were like, this is not scaling. we need to flip this data model. What a terror! You can get really deep into a bad technical decision and really keep doubling down on it. And the choices, there's only two choices: to start over or make it worse. And making it worse means you have to later when you start over, it'll be harder.
Making it worse is easier.
You can't keep it. It's not going to be the same amount of bad. It's only going to get worse unless you fix it now.
Yeah,
I love developing software. So Stytch is now that I know it has not been around forever. I'm curious what is, and then we also talked about like the transition away from passwords. In your view, what does the timeline of authentication look like? At what points did it start to become important? Like, what did it look like in the first phase, early days of the internet versus now, versus what do you think the future looks like? Are we going to be finally done with passwords? What is like the trajectory going to look like from here on? Yeah, so I think passwords have been around as long as the internet has been around. They've been around for maybe even longer than that. Our conference rooms in our office are named after either famous passwords or bad passwords. So we have Open Sesame is one. So that's pretty bad.
That's a good one. Yeah,
that's a good one. One of your conference rooms is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
It is.
That's so bad.
We have Hunter 2 as well.
Hunter 2.
So
that's pretty good. Did you have one that says password?
Yes.
Definitely.
Okay. Those are all the classics.
Yeah. All the classics. We have one after my dog's name, and we have one after my co-founder's dog's name. It's pretty good. So yeah.
That's also the password technically.
Yeah. A classic bad password.
That would be a bad password too.
Your dog 123 or whatever. Yep.
That's good.
So yeah, passwords go back like before the internet, right? That was really like the only way that you could authenticate for a long time. There wasn't like the technology to do much else, and so password was a really good approach. Then I think in probably like the late 2000, like early 2010s. Two-factor authentication started to get really popular. You have things like Twilio that make it easy to do an SMS. People realized that as like the number of online accounts you had started to proliferate, this problem of like password reuse and account takeovers became really rampant. So either people are using like very bad passwords, or they're just reusing the same password across like 100 different online accounts. One of those probably gets breached at some point, and the password gets taken, and then all of a sudden people can log into any online account that you have. So people are like, okay, this isn't working. Like, what can we do? Start to do things like either, an email verification, an SMS verification, whatever it might be to start to increase that security. I think you saw then a lot of innovation around two-factor. So things like authenticator apps, like Google Authenticator, Duo, etc. starting. I think you see sort of just like 2FA via SMS starting to take off, people building like different hardware keys like YubiKey, etc. to make that easier. I think kind of the proliferation of the social login started around that point too. I think like Facebook and Google were like, hey, we really want to sort of like own identities on the internet. And we think that, sign in with Facebook and Google is a really great way to do that. Then you can like port your identity across all these different sites. So you start to see that taking off, and I think people liked that from like a convenience standpoint, right? You don't have to create another password. It's one click, you're logged in. It's pretty easy. So I think you start to see more of that adoption. I think one of the interesting trends from the last like 5-10 years, I guess, is sort of thinking about, okay, what does it look like to go fully passwordless, and starting to have like innovation around kind of like moving towards that future. So WebAuthn was kind of like one of the first attempts at this. WebAuthn is basically the protocol that you'll use for something like a Touch ID or like a YubiKey on your laptop. But that wasn't cross-device, which is pretty limiting because now like your authentication is tied to your device. If you're like me and accidentally break laptops really often, like that's not great because you break your laptop and all of a sudden you no longer have that authentication method. And so I think passkeys have been a really exciting innovation that I think is like teeing us up for a future of more fully passwordless. And what passkeys I think do really well is
Actually, take a step back. How do passkeys work?
Yeah. So
in case I didn't know.
Yeah, passkeys are basically like using your biometric or hardware sort of based verification. So Touch ID and Face ID are going to be the most common ways that you're going to interface with this, and sharing it cross-platform. So it's something that like a lot of the major tech companies, Apple, Google, et cetera, are sort of like aligned on what the standard protocol looks like so that you can do this authentication across platforms. So with like Apple, for example, if you're in that ecosystem, your Touch ID will get like synced with your iCloud account so that you're able to do then Face ID on your on your phone, so that you can do basically passwordless across these different devices and be able to log in no matter which device that you have. I think one of like the big limitations of that approach historically was also that you'd have to set up a different authentication method on your phone versus your laptop because like the biometric tied to it is going to be different. And so passkeys is sort of figuring out how to like sync that across devices. So it's requiring you to do like a biometric authentication, which is great from both a user experience perspective. It's super easy. You don't have to do anything. You just, hold your phone up. And it's also great from a security perspective, because it requires you to have possession of that device and actually do that biometric authentication. So I think that's kind of like winning on both convenience and security. I think the big limitation for that rolling out more completely is that it is very like hardware based. And so you need to have a device that has that enabled for it to work. So I think we'll continue to move towards that. I think that's probably like the best bet that I've seen so far in terms of going fully passwordless. I think it'll still take time, just because of that like sort of device proliferation that needs to happen. So that's kind of like where I'm seeing things right now. I'm not sure that's going to be like the end all be all. I think we'll continue to see like different innovation in the space, and I think you see people trying to kind of like figure out what does it mean to have like an identity on the internet. I think a lot of like Web3 crypto stuff is like trying to form kind of like their own version of like what is identity. So I think it's like a really interesting thing that is being pushed on in a lot of different directions, but I think we're still far from like widespread consumer adoption of anything like that, of like a crypto-based sort of Web3 identity, but
will Stytch support WorldCoin?
Yeah.
Right.
Login with WorldCoin. Login with Iris.
Yeah, exactly.
So exciting. I use Clear at the airport. That's a passkey. That's how I log into the airport.
Right.
So,
With your eyes, yeah.
Yeah. Kind of. Clear is the Disney Fast Pass of the airport.
Yes.
Yeah. It makes no sense to me. That's a real company.
Well,
I use it. But it's weird that airports agreed to it.
yeah,
I'm just saying.
I agree.
Yeah. It didn't even occur to me that like pre-Twilio, it would have been very hard to roll two-factor, or at least like in this way where you have SMS two-factor. And then it makes me wonder if like, well, everyone has a phone and everyone has SMS. So if you had to roll out two-factor, it would be through phones. And then people had to realize that SMS was not secure. And then that's how authentication apps came about. So in a way, Twilio started the dominoes that like ended up in Duo and Auth and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating. Two-factor was a misstep, I think, in the history of Auth. Yeah. I really don't like having to pull my phone out to log into anything.
Your laptop, yeah.
Yeah, I think it really is like a Band-Aid on bad password management and security. Like if you could have a complex, unique password for all of your different applications, and just like, pull that out of your head and not have to like rely on a password manager, like that'd be perfect potentially. But that's just like not how the world works.
Yeah.
And so people had to slap on two-factor to like help protect user accounts and basically say, okay, we can't trust you to like set a good password, so here's 2FA.
Yeah. There's like, it's doubling down on a bad technical decision. Yeah. You should have gotten rid of passwords in the first place. That takes so much imagination though.
I want to briefly kind of get back and talk about fraud a little bit more. So like, I'm just curious, in your time at Plaid, obviously interested in this question a lot. And then I'm just kind of curious about how your concept of fraud has evolved over time. Because again, there's so many different attack vectors. So I'm kind of interested, like what are kind of like the useful concepts when thinking about fraud prevention? because people can, it seems like, do all sorts of creative things. And then kind of, now with AI and everything, just like how is your understanding of how to do fraud prevention kind of advanced over time?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's probably kind of like two main concepts or like different sort of attack vectors that I think a lot about when it comes to fraud. So the like background I came from at Plaid was very much focused on like account takeover fraud. So you're trying to get access to someone else's account to do some damage. That was kind of like one of the things that was really top of mind for us when we were starting Stytch, is like, how do we build authentication that is robust to account takeover attacks? And that's some of how we sort of got into the fraud detection space, was figuring out, okay, how can we better build authentication to protect against these account vectors? Typically, they look like pretty high velocity attacks where you have like a bot that's trying to, do a bunch of credential stuffing attacks, basically try all these different passwords, see if any of them land either for a specific user or just like at a specific application, try a bunch of different iterations of that. So it tends to be like high velocity bot driven attacks. The other piece that I think we've gotten more into at Stytch as we built this out, and it is a good sort of like product to prevent against this type of abuse as well, is like account abuse. So sometimes that'll be like a high velocity bot attack where you're trying to just like sign up for a bunch of, say free accounts. If you can get some like access with that free tier, you want to create a bunch of accounts so that you can abuse that. You get a bunch of different free tiers and take advantage. I think we see that really rampant with sort of two different main verticals. One is any AI company that has a free tier, super valuable resources.
Compute of any kind, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And then another use case we see is if you have like any kind of like computing power, Bitcoin mining, people will do that. So that's another example, and that will have like the high velocity bot attacks, but sometimes it's more like manual abuse of like you have either a person or like a click farm that's like creating a bunch of free accounts. And so that's how we've sort of like approached this lens of fraud detection and prevention, is basically how do we make sure that you're able to like keep your users' accounts secure and also make sure that like people aren't abusing their accounts. And so one of the ways that we do that is with a device fingerprinting product. Basically, we're doing 3 different levels of fingerprinting. We look at your TLS fingerprint, your device fingerprint, and your browser fingerprint, and we can use that to identify, did this originate from a programming language or is this coming from a real device? It's coming from a real device. Are they trying to like churn through some characteristic to make it look different, like churn through user agents, IP addresses, something like that? But at the end of the day, this is actually like the same hardware fingerprint. And we can like block those high velocity attacks then by sort of identifying those characteristics and identifying patterns in sort of like the behavior, so that we're able to say, yeah, this is like a high velocity attack. This is, and you can feed back data points as well. So say, okay, this person like, they did something abusive in your application when they created an account, prevent them from ever creating another account. And we can like look at stable identifiers of their device to be able to say, yeah, they're like trying to spoof that they're some different person, but actually this is the same person. Like, don't let them sign up for another account.
Yeah, that is interesting. This, I actually don't even know if this is within the purview of this problem, but just this morning on a group chat, there was a company that was saying, so AWS reached out to them, or it was GCP or someone, that a company registered a domain name similar to that of a YC company and then pretended to be that YC company to get the I think it's like $400,000 of YC AWS credits. And I was like, that's genius. I would have not thought of that. Because they already have like domain names that are along the lines of getcompany.com, because all the company.coms are gone. So you just have to do like trycompany.com and be like, hey, hi, I'm from trycompany.com or YC company. And then have the website redirect or something. And it's not terrible. It's not terrible. It's kind of genius. I respect it. And it's for Bitcoin mining naturally. Yeah. It's like $500,000 of Bitcoin mining. Surely you can turn that into like at least $200,000. Yeah. Like even if you're bad at Bitcoin mining, even.
I think that's one of the things I really enjoy about working in this space, is just like the creativity of people to like do abuse on the internet is like mind blowing. Like every week I find some new thing that I'm like, why did you do this? How did you think of this?
Yeah.
Like, this is wild.
That's fantastic. That's so funny. It's like being like security at a bank and like doing like front door security at a bank. It was like, wow, I'm really impressed by how creative all these robbers are. It's so fascinating. It's just a love for the game. So good. I'm curious. You talked about authentication and like bypassing authentication as a form of fraud. Do you see the other end of it too with authorization? There's like people that have authenticated accounts but are accessing things they're not supposed to access within the organization.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't have anything built out like specifically around this beyond having just like
Good access management.
Management. So ideally you don't leave any doors open. I think it's something that we're thinking about though, of like kind of like visibility into like what people are doing in your application and giving people more insights into that. So yeah, we haven't built anything out there yet. And ideally you're building things in a good, solid way. But obviously that's like not exactly how the world works. There's
Yep.
always going to be something wrong. So figuring out how we can help people is something that is top of mind. So maybe there'll be something soon. We'll see.
At some point, I don't even know how you'd solve the problem other than just having really good access management. If there's like patterns of behavior associated with, I'm picturing like Hogwarts, like students going to the unauthorized part of the library. It's just like, that's the image in my head. But in reality, it would be, what? That's what I picture. I don't know. Just if you're wondering how to name the product, I feel like there's something in there in the Harry Potter books that could be a good place to start.
We won't charge you for that.
Yeah, it's free naming advice. We actually on the side we run a naming consultancy. So we name products.
Yeah. Greptile's our side job.
Yeah. Why did you go with Stytch with a Y?
Yeah, so we were kind of trying to figure out what is a name that we feel like relates to what we're building, but also is going to be unique and memorable. And so the way we were kind of like iterating on name ideas is that my co-founder and I had a Slack workspace that we set up when we were like still kind of figuring out if we were even starting the company, and we had a company names channel, and we just like threw stuff in there, and we'd like go and look at the online footprint for that name and say, okay, is there anything that's like too close in sort of like what they're building, or do we think this is like potentially unique enough? And so something we were saying a lot at the time is like, we want to make it so that you can really easily stitch together your authentication flows. One of the like frustrations we had with Auth0 in particular is that we felt like they were giving you kind of like the fully built solution, and it was, you know, all stitched together already, and you didn't get to customize it. And we wanted to give you those building blocks that you could sort of customize and turn into your own experience. And we were like looking at Stytch, and we were like, okay, there's like a lot of tech companies that are spelled the normal way and are Stytch. And we looked at Stytch with a Y, and there was basically nothing. The .com like looked like it had been abandoned. Basically, we were like, okay, we think we could get this .com. There's nothing that would sort of be like competing for attention. And so yeah, put the Y in there to give it a little bit of a unique spin.
The Y is genius because it's just this morning I was texting someone. Like, oh yeah, we're meeting with the CTO of Stytch today. I was like, oh, Stytch with a Y, and I was like, yeah. That one, Stytch with a Y. That's exactly right. And it got me thinking about. Have you heard this concept of like how this is like an old marketing thing, but they would teach you to replace the C in your company name with a K. So it's like cars but with a K.
Yeah.
Because it's just so much more like memorable to just have a K instead of a C. Because then like that's like, oh yeah, it's like it's the word in English, and that just gets stored in my memory with all the other words in English. But then if it's misspelled in a way that's obvious, like Stytch is like, well yeah, you pronounced with a Y, it's still pronounced Stytch. Yeah. Just that like really if you put a C with a K, it will still be pronounced the same way. Very interesting.
People will misspell it sometimes without the second T, which was like not something we had thought about at all. Yeah. Like never occurred to us when we were starting it. We started seeing it happen. We were like, okay, maybe we should get that domain too. But the price for that domain was like way higher than what we paid for Stytch.com. And so we were like, okay, it's not worth it. We'll just like buy the AdWord on Google for it. So we do that, but otherwise two T's.
we got Greptile.com. We paid $9 for it, which is crazy.
Amazing.
And then we
bought it for $9.
Off of GoDaddy. It was just available. So it was $9.
Okay.
And Greptile.ai at the time was like $80, I think. And you're like, yeah, we should get the .com, obviously. And then we were like, well, at some point we should buy the .ai. And we checked back. And at this point, like there's a TechCrunch article about our fundraise and like there's all this other stuff. It's like,
bought it.
it's like $250,000 or something crazy like that. And I'm like, I'm not paying that. $85 I was having second thoughts on.
I did buy just about like every iteration of Stytch that I could, like Get Stytch, Stytch API, all of those things.
This is the sort of thing you do when you're an auth person, is you come up with like all the ways in which people will try to spook, like all of the risk factors.
Exactly.
And like reduce the risk. So I guess this is for people who live in San Francisco, or I guess do you have the billboards in the Bay Area too? Or like elsewhere in the Bay Area too?
We've had a few on 101, but it's mostly just San Francisco.
Okay. So I think the people that live here and have seen them, they're the two things that strike people. One is the like the negative 10,000 lines plus 12 lines thing on the commit message, like, oh, you can like eliminate a lot of your authentication code. And the second one that is the one on the buses, which is like, it's just auth is just a post request away. So now questions mainly about the second one, which is why a managed service, and like why is the idea of this being API first so appealing?
Yeah, so I think in the B2B context in particular, which is a lot of what those just a request away ads are talking about, is like SSO, RBAC, all these different features that you might want. I think we see just sort of this like endless list of auth requirements that you might be getting from your customer. And so you maybe if you build in-house your initial like email password, maybe even sign in with Google authentication, that can get you pretty far, but at a certain point, people are going to have requirements for SSO and SCIM and RBAC and all of these different things. And I think going with a managed service to begin with, you're going to be able to like get all of that with like one additional API request, or one extra line in your SDK config or whatever it might be, instead of having to spend a bunch of time building those all out yourself. So I think auth can sometimes look like approachable for like sort of a basic use case, but once you start to scale, you're gonna have all these additional requests. And so something we really focus on is like, how can we serve you wherever you are today, but also wherever you're going, and make it really easy for you to scale with your customers. So I think that's one of the big sort of like value props of going with a vendor is just getting that extensibility. I think the reason we are really focused on kind of like the API first is giving you those building blocks so that you also don't feel limited in how you can grow and scale. As your business grows, you probably have more sort of strict requirements about UX, maybe security flows, things like that. Your needs are going to change. And so we want to make it easy for you to start. We have like pre-built front-end components. We have also a headless SDK. So if you don't want to implement any of like the client-side session management, stuff like that, but you do want to own your UX, you can do that. And then if you have like really complex requirements, you can just go with a direct API. We have backend SDKs, but you could also just go bare metal API if you have some specific needs. I think something that also really affords us is an ability to do a lot of like in-house rip and replaces, because you might have like really complex workflows that you built when you were building in-house, and to try and like sort of pigeonhole that and figure out how to make it work with a really sort of like rigid auth provider might be challenging. But we want our product to feel like you have the best-in-class authentication team at your company, and they're building incredible SDKs and documentation, which internal team that you've ever worked with does that? No one, but we want it to feel like an internal team that you get to work with, because you kind of get to customize it how you want. It feels like it was built for you, and it feels like it unlocks what you need it to, but you don't have to go and figure out how to hire that team. You get to just use us.
That's awesome.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. What I was going to say is that, you guys have built a beautiful developer tool. We're building a developer tool. I was just wondering if you have any advice or guidance for us.
Yeah, I think building for developers, the most important thing is like just being really clear about like how things work and what you can do with the product. Like I think developers just want to be able to like understand something and understand how it's going to like work for them. And so I think like not overthinking things and just being really kind of like true to yourselves too. I think that's one of the things that we really try and do with Stytch. I think it comes through in some of those billboard ads is like, we don't take ourselves too seriously. Like we want to make your lives better as developers. We're developers that can relate, and like, this is like how we would think about this, and just sort of like being really, true to yourself and like just speaking to kind of like the engineer. I think where it goes wrong is if you, try and put too much of a spin on things or like try and be too high level. Like I think engineers just, you want to understand, like, how does this work? Like, what does this do for me?
Yeah. All the blog posts of ours that do the best are the ones that go into like gruesome detail about the inside of our product. It's very interesting. It's also interesting to see the transition from like who software used to advertise to back in the day, and it would be like advertising to leadership. And then the intermediate step was the Twilio Ask Your Developer billboard, which is still not talking to the developer. It's talking to the person that should talk to the developer. And then like now you see like Vercel, which just says NPM IAI, or Stytch being like, here's just the diff like line changes. And you're like, this is talking directly to a developer and no one else. There's no one else needs to read this. There was this this article could have been about the Stytch one too. I think this one was about I think it actually did mention the Stytch billboard along with the Vercel one. And there was like an SF Chronicle article, which was, are these SF billboards making you feel stupid? Us too. It was just the NPM IAI and the diff and like all the billboards that are like extremely esoteric for a very specific person, advertising directly to developers. It's so fun. It's changing. Developers buy software now. Yeah. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we see that like even with our enterprise customers, like an engineer is often like the key sort of like decision maker and driver. You maybe have to get buy-in then from like finance or other sort of compliance, other orgs, but like if you don't win over the engineer, like you got nothing.
Yeah, we've like 100% roughly of our 50 largest customers are all then engineers pushing it through and like have like just wanting the product and they're willing to go through it, and like especially newer companies, I think the organizations seem to, I'm sure you're seeing the same things, like they've shifted around just kind of letting developers buy whatever. Because they're like, oh, if you like it and you're like the most expensive knowledge worker at this company, and if you think this is going to make you, and I think people trust them to be generally level-headed and prudent with spending, and so they're like, well, if you want this and you think it's worth the amount of money it is, I'm sure it is, I'm just going to listen to you.
Exactly.
Incredible. How can people learn more about Stytch, both if they are interested in using it and if they want to work there? Are you hiring at all?
Yeah, so our website, stytch.com with a Y, we are hiring. We're hiring for quite a few roles on the engineering team. We're hiring for our second PM right now. So lots of open roles. I'm pretty active on Twitter too, so you can find me there. It's my full name. But yeah, would love to chat with anyone that wants to use Stytch, wants to work for Stytch, all of the above.
Nice. For people listening on audio, Rajat just hit my knee when Julianna said hiring engineers. I want to make it clear, not only do I already have a job, I also don't think I'm a good enough engineer to build authorization software.
Oh, so me, I'm leaving.
We'll talk about this when the podcast is done recording. Can't believe it. All right. This has been a great episode. Thank you so much for coming. This is great. This is a topic that I feel like I know so much more about than when we started this conversation. 0 to 95, I would even say. Awesome. Maybe I could work at Stytch now, actually.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
It was great.